So that's, and they have really a nice, and now this is the Rumor Incorporated. This is down at Fort Pierce also. The Carlton family. And of course they have, they're number 20th in the nation and 5th in Florida. And I'm not sure, I think. Okay, this is coming home now. This is out of at our beef teaching unit here, right on 23rd, where the Sandhill cranes come and spend the day. And of course that's the old guy that's speaking to you. But Merle took that nice picture just last fall or last winter. Well, I mean, some time ago. Okay, let's see. So that's the end of the pictures. But I want to say a few more words, if I may. You see, I think I got a few minutes yet. Well, so I wanted to mention some of these breeders who really made a contribution. Now, as I mentioned, the Brahmin breeders came into existence, and that was really a contribution. And see, if you know the beef cattle industry in Florida, most cattlemen, they want a little Brahmin in that cow, in that mother cow. Why? Because it resists ticks, it can subsist on lower plane of nutrition, they can stand the heat, and so on. But they're not some of them are not so good on reproduction. And as you notice, some of those, the quality of the carcass is not quite so good. So you want a combination of Brahmin with the British. When I say British, that means Hereford and Angus, primarily, and then Charolais. But anyway, so some of these early pioneer Brahmin breeders were U.S. Sugar Corporation down at Clewiston, A. Duda and Sons, you saw the picture there, over at Cocoa, and you know they were big in vegetables, but they also got in the cattle business over around Cocoa. And also W.H. Stewart at Bartow, they had one of the top purebred Brahmin herds in the whole country, and they were a good cooperator. Norris Cattle Company in Ocala, which it's out of existence, non-existent now, but they were big contributors. Also the Sandra Gertrudis cattle, have you ever heard of those? From King Ranch in Texas, the red breed. Well, they're also a combination of Brahmin and Shorthorn and so on. Anyway, we had K.D. Eatman down at Boynton Beach, Peters at Miami, and Pancoast at Tampa. And then as we move on, I've already mentioned the Brayfords at Adams Ranch at Fort Pierce, the Brangus up here at Chiefland at Hardee Ranch, and the Wolf Ranch over at Hastings. Then the Angus, you've maybe heard of Stardust Ranch, or Henry Chitty clothing store down on the square. Anybody ever buy clothes there? Well, yeah, my friend Aldo did. Okay, but anyway, they had a top herd of Angus cattle just out here on Wakahoody Road near Micanopy. Okay, so they and the Derisos and also Leroy Baldwin down at Ocala was one of the breeders. Well, okay, and let me move on to what I visualized the University of Florida research contributed. In the early days, I've already mentioned the Range Cattle Station. Dr. W.G. Kirk, he was the first director down there. He was a Canadian that lived here some years. He was an animal nutritionist, and he organized the place. That was in the late 30s and early 40s. Okay, so that still exists. They tried to change the name. You remember, John? They tried to change the name to own a research and education center, but the old Florida cattlemen, they still call it Range Cattle Station. So they reverted back to the Range Cattle Station. But the way that was started is interesting. The cattlemen themselves bought about 2,000 acres of land and then presented it to the state for that station. So cattlemen are not all bad. Okay, so where else do we go? We go to the Everglades Station. Do you all know where Belglade is? On that rich, good muck soil? Well, one time in the 30s, they had an experiment station there with Ralph Kidder. He came here in the early 30s from Michigan, and they solved the problem of copper, cobalt deficiency that our friend George Davis had a lot to do with. So George Davis got famous because of work down at Belglade copper and zinc and cobalt deficiencies. But anyway, it's interesting that at one time cattle were a big part down at that station. Now there are no cattle at all. It's all vegetables and soils and so on. Okay, and why do you think that is? Because that land's too expensive to grow cattle on. Cattle is growing usually on sub-marginal, low-cost land. Okay, you probably you've never heard of this before. The USDA station in Brooksville, Florida. You know where Brooksville is? On Highway 41, just north of Tampa. And this station was started in the 30s. And it's interesting, the land is owned by the USDA, the cattle are owned by the University of Florida. So it's a very nice cooperative arrangement, and they really made a contribution down there. And I'll boast a little by saying one of my first graduate students was director down there for some years, Cal Burns. So I give him credit. Okay, where else? Up at Quincy. We had a station up at Quincy, Florida, that's just west of Tallahassee, for nutrition work and breeding work. And then, more importantly, in 1951, the Beef Cattle Research Union was started here out on the Monte Oca Road, just beyond, next to the Gator Nationals, if you everybody. Anyway, that has been a landmark experiment station. And so that's still going strong. It started out with about 300 heifers from Likes Brothers that represented a typical cow at this time, started on a crossbreeding program using Brahman, Hereford, Angus, and Shorthorn bulls, and that experiment's still going forward. So that's a great place, and I had the privilege of working there. Well, I want to mention a little more about the Indians, the Seminoles. It's interesting that in the 1930s, you remember out west they had these tremendous droughts, the cattle died and so on. Well, anyway, they shipped cattle from the San Carlos Reservation, Indian Reservation in Arizona, by rail to the Indians here in Florida, the Seminole Indians. And the cattle were so emaciated and weak from almost starvation, a lot of them died in transit. But anyway, they survived, a lot of them, and that's really the basis for their modern cattlemen. So, okay, I'm going to close now. I think you've heard enough. Okay, so what's the future? Or what's the present state? I'm going to say, and I'll use Deseret again, they went from a 50% calf crop, now they're in the high 80s. They went from a 250 or 300 pound weaning weight to 500 to 550 pounds weaning weight. Now, I know more about that range, but other ranches has improved also. So I'm going to conclude by saying Florida's come a long way, and I think a part of the credit goes to this university for their genetics research, their nutrition research, and so on. So my hope for the future is this. Well, anyway, cattle numbers in Florida, if you can believe it, are starting to go down a little, beef cattle. You know why? Because these developments, people are taking them for homes and developments. So there's less land. So we used to ship out 900,000 calves that went west every fall. But that's less now, Alto, I don't know. They told me over at the department that it's around 800,000. So that's quite a decline in the recent years, really. But my goal is this for the future. A 90% calf crop weaned and 600 pound weaning weight. Now, I probably won't be here to see it, but that's my hope. Okay, I thank you.
Thanks, Alvin. I guess we can all now go over and help ourselves to the groaning board. Bill Drummond, have you got a question or a comment about tonight's paper? And we'll go around the table.
I don't have one written down, but I first of all want to say I learned more about beef cattle here tonight than I have all the rest of my life. I never know exactly what I ought to order when I go to eat somewhere. They advertise it, certain kind of beef or something else. I like beef all right, I just don't know what I ought to be. Black Angus, is that it?
Well, that seems to be the trend, and they theoretically and traditionally are more tender as far as the cut of meat is concerned. That's sort of the premier animal. But some of the other, interesting enough, in the before World War I or shortly after, Wisconsin did an experiment with comparing beef cattle to dairy cattle as far as tenderness, eating quality. You know what they found out? The dairy cattle were equally or more tender than the beef cattle. Of course, they didn't advertise that too much, I guess. But anyway, there is a terrific difference in the cuts of meat, as you know. The tenderloin, the prime rib, the upper round, and so on. And some of our people are doing a good bit of research right now, trying to enhance the quality of the chuck and the lower price cuts by processing and doing various things. So we got an active meats research department here in the department. So it's important, and there's nothing worse than to cut into a steak and be so tough you can't cut it. But that's one of the Brahmins tend to be less tender than the British breeds. And so that's one of the problems if you get too much Brahmin. But by the same token, years ago in the early research study, they found that the steers from one of the Brahmin bulls down at the Onus Station, and that Onus Station is near Wauchula in Hardee County. That's where it is. But anyway, after the bull was disposed of, they found out his progeny were quite tender. So there's a genetic base for tenderness. And in fact, the Australians right now have a patent on a gene for tenderness in beef cattle. So that's how far genetics has moved.